Okay, welcome everybody. We'll take a little bit of time to get everybody inside here. So this session is more information about once you get your data, what to do with it. So again, these are all the experts, and ask questions, because this is your shot of glory to get all the right answers. I do also want to highlight that these guys are all from companies that are founding pledge members, so all super knowledgeable and committed to this endeavor. I'd like to turn it over to Jeff Tang. He's with BlackRock, and he's going to be running the panel this time. So Jeff, please take it away.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks everyone for joining. This is an exciting panel to have our panelists speak about concrete and tangible ways to kind of dig into the data once you have it. By the way, just feel free to ask questions throughout the session. Just pop it in the chat whenever you feel like it. So I'd like to start maybe just going down the panel and having the folks introduce themselves and kind of what was the path to getting the data within your organization, and kind of provide the brief context of the DII efforts that you've been working on. So Bob, why don't we start with you?
Great, thank you. Really happy to be here in this great conference. I'm kind of amazed at how much I keep learning every time, talk to people about this. So, you can never get too much exposure. It's great to have all these other companies too, and not just go it alone. There's so much learning to be shared. So really appreciate everybody who's putting this conference on. So I'm Chief IP Counsel at Seagate. We kind of kicked off this effort, not really knowing where it was going. A couple of years ago, we were starting, how do we celebrate innovation differently in ways that can bring out these issues of inclusion, and kind of like from the film Ratatouille, where great chefs can come from anywhere, great innovations can come from anywhere. That's how we were sort of starting. Let's share these stories. It's not just the same kind of big topics that get shared around the company, but there's a lot of innovations going on that people aren't aware of. And so that was sort of the instigator. And then the USPTO report came out, and it was like, I'm sure that we do, a perfectly good job of getting the same participation, of women as we do from our technical community generally. But let's just check. And that's where we started going down this path. Well, how do we get that data? And yeah, we went through, some publicly available resources, and then talked to our diversity and inclusion folks and HR, and more than happy to help. So we're very fortunate that way. So we're able to get a lot of, our own real data. And it's just been, working with different companies, throwing stuff out there, with the Richardson Oliver group, and, seeing how our data could maybe help improve some algorithms that were out there. And this is where we are today.
Great, thanks, Bob. Maybe we could go to Jason to give a quick intro.
Sure. I'm Jason Friday. I'm Senior Patent Counsel at Lenovo. We're a little newer into the game, but we've been working really hard over the past, right at about a year. We started this last summer. Our Chief Patent Counsel, John Mulgrew, Bob mentioned that USPTO report on women diversity, and John Mulgrew at Uber when he first heard that, and so started the conversation there. And once he came over to Lenovo, brought that with him as one of the goals for our group. And so I came into the project at the end of last summer, and at that point we had gotten the buy-in from our leadership to come into doing that. Involved just basically using the USPTO report as kind of the skeleton of like what we were trying to do internally. And so we had a summer associate put together a presentation using that, and just said like, hey, this is the type of data we're wanting and we need your help. And we were able to get a lot of buy-in, and from that we were able to get the information from our HR We're already porting a lot of information from HR for our patents as far as, inventors address citizens need for filing application. We could pay, any privacy issues we've already kind of taken care of with respect to those things. We're just wanting to layer as it relates to diversity, and we're able to pull in also gender diversity, race and ethnicity, and we're still in the process of working on veteran status because that's in a different database. But we ported that into our system, and we've been looking at how to use that data over the past year.
Great, thanks, Jason. And last but not least, Justin.
Yeah, thank you. Justin Cook, Associate General Counsel for IP at the Nielsen Company. And the way that I kind of got into this and that Nielsen came into this is in 2018, I was at the Intellectual Property Owners annual meeting and sat in a discussion of this. At the time, I think it was well, there were a few people, but one of the economists from the World Intellectual Property Organization who had done some of the early work on how to infer gender from first names, and then published a lot of that data and described the extent of the problem. And one of the things that really stuck with me was that it was going to, at the current trend rate, it was going to be another 100 years or thereabouts until there was sort of gender parity in this measurable contribution to the innovation economy in the form of being named on a patent. And I was just sort of stunned by that. And after thinking about it for a little while, I decided, well, at a minimum, I had to be able to figure out where we're at on this at Nielsen. And I started plinking away with the tools that I could find from the WIPO resources and sort of in the do-it-yourselfer spirit, played around with Excel until I convinced myself that I had something that was right. It turned out it wasn't all that close because there were tons of issues, but it was enough to get a running start and to start to bring attention to this stuff at Nielsen. And then since then, we've been regularly reporting our metrics on a regular cadence, and with the ultimate goal, whenever you measure something, especially in a corporate environment, the ultimate goal is to reproduce the trend of up and to the right. And so that's what we're trying to use these metrics to do, to number one, make the case there's something to be done here, and number two, here's a few things that we're trying. We're going to keep trying things until we satisfy ourselves that we're moving in the right direction. So that's it. Happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Justin. So it sounds like you all have experience getting this data, and it's probably a huge data set, and it's probably drinking from a fire hose. So how do you sift through the data sets and reduce the noise? And how do you establish the baseline for the data that you receive? So Justin, maybe I could start with you.
Yeah, so as far as, I'm at a company, the Nielsen company is one of the top 300 patent recipients in the world, at least for US patents. So it's not an insignificant number of patents, but it's also, we're not in that like top 50 tier. So it is feasible to go through the data set of 2,000 inventors over the last 20 years or something, the length of time that those patents are relevant. And really like go into the weeds and figure out, oh, what's going on here? This is a Jean from France, not a Jean from Wyoming, or this is a, and start to pick apart where the numbers that you're starting to see might diverge from a felt sense, which is valuable. And that was ultimately kind of what it took to try to get some accuracy, was to really go through each inventor record by record and either rely on personal relationships or do some sleuthing or follow up with those people, especially for people that have long since left the company, to get an understanding of where we are. And then in terms of baselining, you can compare yourself to industry norms, to the published data from USPTO or from WIPO. But if you do that, you're going to be limited to, and there's nothing wrong with this, I think it should be done, but you will be limited to whatever metrics have been published by those entities. In the case of the USPTO, it's number of patents that include at least one woman inventor, or the women's share of inventorships across kind of all patents, which are a little bit different ways of describing it. And then more recently, the women inventor rate. Those are all, I think, worthwhile things, but they're also going to be focused on patents that have actually issued, or in the PCT case, it'll be published international patent applications. I really encourage everyone that wants to pay attention to this. Don't let that be like the sum total of your effort. Think about what your KPIs ought to be, and then start measuring those and measure yourself against your own past. Like, because I think that's going to be the most meaningful metric for every company. They've got their own nuances and their own kind of technological field and geographic constraints and so on. But if you can just, at Nielsen, we've begun measuring the gender makeup of priority patent applications that are filed each year. Because we think that's a really meaningful expression of the IP team's work to expand the inclusion of our inventor community. And it's something we want to pay attention to, and it's something we want to celebrate within the organization. And so then our baseline becomes, where were we in 2019? Where are we today? So that's that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, you definitely have to make it fit within your respective organization, because every company is at very different levels of patenting. So that's a very good point. Bob, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo all that stuff. When you're looking at how to compare yourself, how to benchmark, what baselines to create, I agree that, looking at, if you're looking at gender, for example, as your underrepresented inventor metrics, look at what's publicly out there and compare yourselves to that. But you also need to understand, something about your own organization. So it's a mixture of sort of the macro and then looking inward. One thing that once we were able to get, all our current employee information in our database and get, some comfort with how some of the algorithms that are being used, reflects against our data. We're able to look historically, like Justin said. So looking at your own past is very informative. But you've also, you have the ability within your own company to look at things like invention disclosures, the submission rate, what happens throughout the pipeline, the intake, and how are inventors experiencing the intake process, what's their experience through the review process and decision and on down the line, and make sure you're looking at that and slicing and dicing the data. I would just caution people to, you may know your organization really well. Try not to make too many assumptions about what your issues really are. Data isn't always the end all be all, but let the data tell its own story, and don't necessarily go looking for narratives in the data. I expected that the problem wouldn't be anywhere within the processes that my group controlled. That wasn't necessarily the case. So you need to be open when you're looking at that data. And then I guess finally, just when you're figuring out what metrics to use, what KPIs to use, make sure they connect up with, they connect with, I guess, a real message around what innovation means in your company. So this doesn't become just a check the box type exercise. I think a real powerful message is around lost innovations. When we don't do diversity and inclusion right, look at all the innovations we're losing. So the more you can do that and make sure that as you're going through this, you're going to be able to connect up your data and your metrics to the message, that'll keep up the momentum.
Great. How about you, Jason? How do you establish the baseline?
Yeah, I agree with everything Justin and Bob said. I think what I would add, it's one thing that we're still actually struggling with is our internal baseline as far as eligible or likely inventors. Here, somewhat everyone is eligible to invent, whether they're technical or not. So we see some, ideas come from the business group as well, although most are for technical roles. So it's been hard to really establish a baseline of who are likely inventors to see, like, well, do we even have a problem? When we're looking at the numbers. But I think one thing we've decided to do is just, while we're figuring that out, is just really consistency is the key, and so we're just kind of working from right now a baseline that everyone is eligible and everyone is a potential inventor. And so we're kind of using the numbers as they are and tracking those numbers consistently to see if we can affect a little bit. But we're looking at, especially from the inclusion piece of trying to increase the number of people that are involved in the process, particularly our diverse inventors. We're kind of starting from kind of the base level of, every, when we're looking at, 12% female workforce, we're looking within that 12% rather than trying to slice and dice necessarily who has a technical role. And while we know that there are flaws in there, I think we found that throughout this process, there are going to be just flaws in the data. Just have those flaws and try and work around them the best we can. And the main way we can do that is just being consistent in how to use the data.
Great, thanks. My next question is about resourcing. So once you had all this data and you're trying to analyze it, what methods did you use for the analytics? Did you use internal resources or did you go outside? And this is open to anyone can chime in.
I'll start.
The vast majority is on, oh, go ahead.
For the analytics on the gender diversity, it was all me, really. I guess just the patent function, which is really weird and sort of a lost opportunity and something that I'm correcting now because I work at a company that is just chock full of data scientists who care deeply about how to measure things in a robust, statistically representative way. And so I'm taking the opportunity now to go back and connect with some of those folks who are really excited to be engaged. But we haven't really engaged anyone external to Nielsen.
I love my old school spreadsheets and lookup tables and pivot tables and stuff. It's hard to let go of that. I like to own the data to a certain extent. It's fun to play around. You can never, there's never an end to the kind of insights you can gain from it in ways you can slice it up. I mean, just the other day I was looking at some new type of data just around correlating, and this is primarily gender data, but correlating the job levels and how the distribution of job levels among male and female inventors and what the differences in those distributions are, because those types of things can tell you, when I need to go engage inventors and make this process more meaningful for them, more accessible for them. Who do I need to go after? Who do I need to prioritize? There's endless ways to do that, and I just, it's hard for me to give up control of that data because I love to just go back and keep looking for new stuff. So it's all in a big, massive spreadsheet.
Yeah, pretty much the same here. I'm kind of the keeper of the data. I will say we used we packed this data into our patent management system. We use IP Folio, and so you have fields for gender and race and ethnicity within the index files in IP Folio. But still, what's been most, I guess, the way I kind of work is I'll use that to kind of create the report, and I'll export that into Excel and and dicing pivot tables, which I just learned in the past year for this specific purpose. So probably very, you know, it's not very complex. And so I do, kind of to Justin's point, want to start utilizing some of the resources we have as far as, data analytics. And I've already started getting into some Power BI tools and trying to start using that as far as trying to take it to the next level. But yeah, just the slicing and dicing. And I think to Bob's point, it does show you, where you need to focus, and also how to potentially fix the problems, because there is no one size fits all answer. I think when I initially started, I thought that, I'd, see the data, I'd see, women aren't as binning at the same rate as men, and I try and just start implementing some stuff to try and get parity in those numbers. But once you are able to slice and dice the data, you can see, well, some of those reasons of potentially why that's happening, or how specifically that's happening in your company. And I know, at least for us, we're a very collaborative, a collaborative environment where, most of our patents have 3 or more inventors on them. And so what we're seeing is that while there was, the disparity between women and men wasn't quite as high when you're just looking at, like, percentage-wise, the overall population. But once you're looking at, who was on the patents as far as the inventor group, we saw that, it was overwhelmingly like all male teams that were inventing, and only, I think I'll show the data in just a little bit, maybe 10% actually included a female. And so when you're looking at it in that way, it's pretty clear that, we do have a disparity, and it also gives you kind of a direction to go as far as how to address that disparity. So while we do want to look at, increased numbers overall, we want to specifically target, maybe how our inventor team, so that do many solutions and initiatives that you work on. All right, I'll try.
Great. So it sounds like tip number 1 for the audience is learn Excel. You can YouTube tutorials online. So just get familiar with Excel. So moving on to the next question, how do you interpret the data, and any insights you can share with respect to underrepresented groups that you're looking at? And I'd like to go to Jason on this one, because I know he has some slides prepared. So Jason, if you take it away.
Sure. And just apologies if my audio is spotty. I don't have my headphones handy, but I'll share slides that I'm presenting with on the data. Can everybody see those okay? All right. So essentially, how it made sense, at least for us, it was, I think this task, once you get the data, it can be pretty overwhelming. And I know there was some conversation about this in the last session as well, about, like, there's all this data, and, what can you control? And so I kind of call it my kind of serenity prayer, where I just control the things I can. So what we can control as, as the patent team is looking at our process and the decisions that we're making along that process. And I kind of created this funnel where we broke it down into 4 groups of decision-making processes. Our disclosure group, what are we getting in the door? Our application group, what are we actually filing? Our prosecution, what are we actually getting the patent on, and what's happening during the prosecution stage? And then our secondary application group, what decisions are we making around defending the family of these applications we have? And then from there, I started looking at the metrics at each of those stages. This is kind of the first one that I mentioned earlier, where I just wanted to get an idea of who was inventing in the population, and you can kind of see women versus men, that generally our overall participation rate in the patent process is low, which I thought was surprising. I do caveat that, what I mentioned earlier, as far as, we are looking at our entire population. This isn't limited to likely inventors or people in technical roles. And so I think those numbers would change if you looked at, the groups that are actually inventing on a historical basis. But it still just showed us generally kind of what this was when men. You can see that out of the same 100 employees, 8 men have submitted ideas, and only 1 woman has submitted an idea. And I'll caveat too that it's a very binary way of looking at gender. We recognize that. And we also don't have data for, I think, about 20% of our, and this is US population, just based on either them choosing not to disclose to HR, or maybe they don't fit into the binary labels as well. And so from there, this is where I did start to break it down a little bit more. And we found this to be kind of the most helpful, and this is the data I was referring to earlier. When we're looking at our team breakdown, this is where we really saw the disparity. And so looking at those little arcs in the middle, they kind of show where men are represented and where women are represented. And women are only represented in less than 20% of our patents that we disclose, either as solo inventors, which account for less than 1% of our inventions, on all female teams, which is small as well, and then in mixed teams, when there are men and women, that accounts for most. And so, we're seeing one, that women aren't really inventing by themselves. They always have a male counterpart on the invention list. And then two, they're just really not represented if you look at the overall portfolio from team breakdown. And we took it even a step further and looked at that mixed team. And what we saw was that the teams really aren't, quote unquote mixed, or like evenly gendered. The 1-to-1 ratio, where it's even gendered, only really accounted for about 12% of that 17%. And so what we're seeing is that really in almost half the cases, when women were included in the process, they were only, one of at least 3 or more men also on the invention. And so what it did for us was kind of tell us, like, hey, we need to maybe look at this a little bit more and try and figure out ways that we can increase female participation, but also make sure that the way we're setting up our teams is also diverse, rather than just trying increasing the number of people, but also looking at like how can we increase diversity on the active teams themselves. And I'll say too that tying this to our process, I think one thing I noticed that I hadn't really tied to diversity before was that, a lot of these teams are, they kind of meet regularly, and it's not really a part of their day-to-day job. We have a certain number of patents that have come through based on patent harvesting, but a lot of times people will just meet outside of their regular job on these teams and just say, hey, let's invent around this topic, and then submit their ideas. And that really, I would say, probably 70% of the way we get patents. And because of that, when these teams are forming, they tend to be all male, they tend to be all white. And, through no fault of their own, just by sheer just numbers, they're more likely to be the ones that get accepted because they're more of them in the pipeline to choose from, and that's what we're starting from. And so we're really targeting our efforts at increasing, not only women, inventing, but also women either recreating these teams themselves, or shaking these teams up and saying, okay, have you considered including women on this team, including more minorities on this team, or adding to the team to try and increase diversity as well. Feel free to stop me at any point. I can probably talk about this all.
Just a quick question from the audience. Has there been any disclosures that had all women inventors?
Yeah, they, not many, but they did account for about one, I would say together between the solo inventor and team inventors, less than 2% of our US applications are all women. So, and part of that is just due to the number of women, in our, that are inventing also.
Jason, I wonder if you observed this. It's something that that I have seen at Nielsen. Inventor groups that include at least one woman are on average a larger inventor team than inventor groups that do not include any women. And this is like an industry-wide phenomenon. It's been described in large data sets. I was shocked that this happens at Nielsen as well. The difference is about 1.5 inventors. Interestingly, in the last year, or last year and a half, as working conditions have changed, that difference has actually ticked up just ever so slightly. where the all male groups are just a little bit smaller, and the groups that include at least one woman are just a little bit larger. Just sort of an interesting phenomenon, something that I bet everyone out there could find in their own company data as you start to look through it. But I wonder, Jason, was that something you noticed?
It's not something that we tracked, but now that you say it, it's something that I know to be true just in, working here the past 4 years. I guess I do question why that might be. I guess I have my own thoughts, but I think as Bob said, I try not to infer, my thoughts on why things happen and just kind of let the data speak for itself and try and correct it. But yeah, that is something that I've seen here too as well.
There's definitely a larger share of inventions that are submitted that are solo inventions, a larger share than the overall breakdown that are solo inventions from men. So just naturally, you're going to have more, women inventing in larger groups, although the disparity isn't as pronounced at Seagate. An interesting thing that we've seen, because we also break down things geographically, and so we have large research centers in Singapore. We have a lot of research coming out of Europe, and then of course various US facilities. And we have tremendous engagement among women inventors in our Asia facility. So the question is there, some bias, or is there, disparate treatment of disclosures coming out of Asia? And is that what's impacting, especially since we have much more engagement of women inventors? Is it that, we have an issue also with, how we treat inventions coming out of our Asia facilities? So there's all that kind of stuff that's wrapped up in the data as well that needs to be pulled apart.
Yeah, I think for us too, so I'm pointing to the US data, but it is something that we are tracking by geo. And I think just even how we were structured comes into play, just where, we're taking on different companies somewhat geographically based. So even the way our patent system or our patent process in the US, and even by business unit, our patent process in the PC group versus our mobile group, which is a Motorola process, a lot of those were inherited from the original companies that they came from. And so we all do things a little bit differently based on just how we were founded, I guess, on some level. And so I've been trying to break it down, not even necessarily by geo, but by portfolio manager for whatever geo. Sometimes that overlaps with geo, just so people can start to break it down in their own process and interpret it in their own. Because even within the company, there may not be a one solution fits all, for how to increase diversity as well.
There's Justin, were you about to say something?
Well, I was just going to add to something that you said, Jason, about reciting the Serenity Prayer before you dive into the data, which I love. I think a lot of people probably appreciate that that view of it. And I just wanted to share my perspective on it. Is even when there are, the patent department is not able to wave its wand and change society at large and so on, and we all get that. But we are the only ones, or certainly the best positioned ones, to be able to put a spotlight on this stuff, because we can get the data, we can choose to present it, we can choose to be transparent about it. And that is not just accepting the things we can't change. That is saying, okay, here's where we are. And some of these things are within our control, some of them are not, but we're going to keep putting a spotlight on it. We're going to keep it top of mind, and we're going to continue to be transparent about it, because we think it's worthwhile to pay attention to it, even the things that aren't within our control to change. So I don't know. I just wanted to. I really, it's just so valuable to use this data as a spotlight, because it is so much more powerful than just starting out with platitudes and saying, boy, we'd love to be more inclusive. Well, of course we would. But if you have data that we can get with these patent records, now it's a call to action. Now there's something to be done. So it's just so important to choose something you're going to be measured against and to be transparent about it. I
think it's good to remember too, this isn't a, do it once and you improve things and you're done. I mean, this is a way of life. It's not a check the box off. This is a new way of approaching things. So we in the IP group, when we go do patent harvest, we can make sure we have diverse and inclusive harvesting groups. But we can't make people go invent, you know, in more diverse teams, but we can get the message out. One of the things we've already seen in just a short amount of time is, you know, we had about a 50% increase in the number of mixed gender engine groups since we've started doing this. And yet the participation rate of women on inventions has remained the same. So it's like people are going out and seeking, you know, more women to bring into their invention groups, for example, but they keep going back to the same people, you know? So that's the other thing too. It's like, you know, we just look at that metric and we're like, hey, we're doing great, but are we really engaging more people than we were before? Maybe not.
A question from the audience about where to focus your efforts. Did you focus on invention disclosures first, maintenance and renewals, or where did you focus the data efforts?
So the one slide I didn't show, or one of the slides I didn't show, so what I did with that pipeline is I did metrics at each of those stages and used the disparities that I was seeing as kind of not necessarily like here's where I'm going, more of a priority list. And so, you know, what we found more disparities at the disclosure stage and also at the prosecution stage. And so because of that, we decided to focus on the disclosure stage, just because I had the greatest number of disparity. And so we let the data kind of dictate where we put our focus on. So while we do want to, you know, tackle all of it, so far it's been mainly around inclusion, getting more people into the process, looking at how they're, you know, how they are in starting the process and what disclosures, whether they're submitting disclosures, has been the primary focus so far for us.
Yeah, the invention.
I mean, we started with recent public patents, you know, and just got to the point where we felt like our internal data was able to match some of these more public tools so that we could apply that to our historic data. And then we, you know, branched into the invention disclosure stuff after that.
Yeah, exactly the same at Nielsen, Bob. And I'll just share, I think one of the most fruitful things that we've done, one of the things that we're happiest about in terms of changing the invention disclosure pipeline is we've done twice now a set of kind of hackathon brainstorming sessions where as appropriate, we've been able to seed some ideas to teams like, hey, you know, focus on this problem, this challenge, let us know what you come up with. And boy, you know, that ensured we got some new faces into the field, into the community. And then, you know, so much of this is a chicken and egg problem, getting some prolific women inventors who can then be mentors and have been through the process and have kind of broken down those barriers. And we really feel good about our invention seeding efforts. It's a hard thing to scale up, but it's really been something that we feel good about.
Another question for the panel from the audience is, has anyone looked at how diverse inventorship has changed between patents recently filed versus those filed 5 or 10 years ago? Has there been any improvement?
Yeah, I can chime in on this one. You know, interestingly, we have seen some improvement on how diverse the teams are. So in other words, what percentage of our patents that issue have women inventors? That's gone up, but the percent of women inventing in the company, the percent of our inventors who are women who are on patents has remained the same for a long, long time. As I think Michael Moore was talking about at yesterday's session, we see a lot of repeat inventors. So both male and female inventors are very much driven by a few very prolific inventors who are well connected around the company, and other people invent with them, and they kind of drive things. And we've long had, key women for a long time, different people, but key women inventors who are those types of people who tend to drive, that activity, as well as male inventors. It's just getting above that percentage of women participating in inventing. That's remained the same for a long time. So it's really interesting, kind of nut to crack. But it's clear that we need to, widen the funnel at the beginning, but get more and more people really, prolific and seasoned, skilled in what makes for good patents. How do you even engage with the system? How do you submit inventions? Because it does tend to be driven, whatever group you're talking about, underrepresented inventors or not, it's driven by the seasoned inventors. So I don't know, it's interesting. I think the message of diversity and inclusion has been embraced, but to the point where we're making more inclusive teams, but we're still not engaging the people that have been not engaged before. I think that's a real difficult nut to crack. That's probably where all the lost inventions are. So you can kind of fool yourself into thinking, well, we've got much more inclusive invention teams, and you can still have all these lost inventions left on the table.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about engagement and sort of having to reevaluate what your invention disclosure process looks like, as you all mentioned. So we only have 3 minutes remaining. So I'd like to just go around the panel and ask, what are the lessons learned? And if possible, if you could highlight what not to do. So if I could start with Bob, what are the lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, I've already said, don't let your assumptions and your biases about your biases get ahead of your analysis. Assume that at some point you're going to buck up against your company culture. Even if your values are inclusion, Seagate has to be hyper efficient in our operations. At what point does taking the time to be more diverse and inclusive in building invention teams get in the way of getting product out the door? And is somebody going to say something about that? So just don't think it's all going to be, smooth sailing just because at the start, everybody embraces this. And then I just say on the to-do, remember to, celebrate innovation and weave these efforts into your positive story about what innovation means for your company. Because you got to tie this into, it's not just inclusion and diversity for inclusion and diversity's sake. If the company can embrace how this improves innovation, how this improves our operations, how this improves our growth, you need to weave that in.
Justin, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess once you get this data, it can't be just for the patent function. Pick out a few things that you're going to move the needle on as a group. Circle up and get everybody on the same page that these are important efforts to expand the pool of innovative potential at the company. And whether it's the woman inventor rate, the number of patents with a female inventor, if you want to focus on, like we did at Nielsen, priority patents so that you disclude all the continuations and so forth, and national phase applications that can swamp out the signal. But decide on something that you're going to be accountable for, and then be transparent about it. Share it on your company intranets, share it with your general counsel, share it with the legal department, share it with your engineering teams. Use it as an excuse to partner with ERGs and have some more intentional engagement with other communities other than the same set of prolific inventors that you regularly touch base with. And then just continue to report this information. If it comes to the patent function and then it stays in a vacuum there, it doesn't do anybody any good. So do yourself a favor and be transparent about it, and then you can take credit for whatever happens.
Jason, what about you?
Yeah, oh, that's great. I think I would add that I think an assumption I made was, that it would, like, this was separate from my job, like looking at the diversity was separate from kind of my functions as far as like getting the process going. But what I found is that, and I think this was mentioned in the earlier session, even the seemingly neutral processes that we have in place have an impact on diversity. And so it's been a really good check at, what we do normally or how we normally think, how that may impact diversity. And we're able to see the metrics and see like, oh, we implemented this idea, or I'll give, I guess, a concrete example. We're looking more at, I guess the quality over quantity kind of transition where we're trying to be more intentional about the types of patents that we are creating. And so, I was kind of relaying that to one of the ERGs the other day, and the feedback I got was, well, you are somewhat stopping, there are not a lot of women in those fields that you mentioned. And so the impact that might have, that might negatively impact diversity because you are now targeting specific groups. And so then that becomes a conversation that I need to have with that group about, how do we increase diversity in your group? But just keeping in mind that it's all intertwined, and that, while there's no right answer, and of how to try things, everything's intertwined, and it's all a part of like making the process better. And so it's not separate from the process, it's a part of the process, and it needs to be thought of that way.
So I just want to say that we're going to keep going as long as there's questions. So I encourage you all to keep asking. If you want to raise your hands and put on your cameras, we can make it a little more open. But these guys will stay here as long as you have some questions. So keep it coming. I'll ask a question. So, one of the things that comes up a lot is, how do you figure out your potential inventor pool, right? Because when you're looking at who's inventing, it's based on what your inventor pool looks like. So how do you actually figure that out? It turns out that's kind of a tricky question.
That is a tricky question. And, we've got, turns out a large proportion of our female engineering core is more in like the processing areas. So one of the things we're looking at too is, doing a much better job of documenting and awarding trade secret stuff, getting education out to people who innovate in more trade secret areas, and that we want to be able, get them to submit invention disclosures as well, because that's not as well known in those areas. So we do track that as well as the patent stuff too. It helps our our diversity numbers a little bit by tracking that way, but yeah, it's difficult to know exactly, what's the pool that you're looking at. Right now, we're mostly just benchmarking against technical employee data.
This is Jesse Fenty. I'm speaking on Thursday. So I'm working with the National Society of Black Engineers. I'm a patent attorney in the field for about 20 years. So one of the issues that we see is just, in terms of this whole discussion, is about representation. So my question for the Lenovo and Seagate and Nielsen would be, so one of our we have a program called NSBE Invents, National Society of Black Engineers. So we want to display Black inventors. I mean, so people who are working in the IP education space, they know the Lost Einstein's paper that came out is very big on representation. You have to see yourself. White men have, one of the things about that paper was that women don't get inspired by men inventors. That was surprising to me. So we all need to see ourselves as inventors to be inventors. So what we're asking companies to do, we don't want all the data. We just want a few Black inventors from the companies. Just give us a few names. We can look up their patents. So I'm wondering if those companies that are here, right, you always don't get the most patents out in the country. You get a significant number of patents. Like, would you just disclose one or two, say Black inventors or women inventors that we could use in our publication information to display to our members, who the inventors are, and then maybe have them come out and do a presentation and just talk about their patents and talk about their ideas. Is that, we're not asking for data, we're not asking for all your data, we're just asking for one or two faces that we can use in our media.
Yeah, that'd be something we'd be willing to work with you on. Obviously, really their approval. We could definitely work with you on that. Sounds awesome.
Jason and Jesse, I'll connect you guys in an email. And if there's anybody else that wants to participate, I'm happy to put you all together.
Yeah, I think my audio is breaking up.
Oh, Ruthie, I see you. I'll put you in too.
I think that's a great idea. And it's something that we've been doing internally too. And kind of how we started all this was that innovators circle that I was talking about before. And every quarter we highlight 5 innovators, and it doesn't have to be patent based. In fact, a lot of them are not patent based, but it's from all areas around the company, and it's about getting stories out there of innovation that might not be as well known as well as the well-known ones. But frankly, it's also about just making sure we've got people from around the world and different faces that folks can relate to. And the sort of comments that we get on those internal stories, just every single time, it's like, this makes me so proud to work here. I mean, those kinds of comments, it makes it's working. It's really important. You can't just, go to the hard data, that the softer stuff and the way people feel about it, makes a huge difference too.
And that's how you tackle racism and sexism, is you show the images. Racism is largely based on the idea that Black people aren't as good as white people. That's largely what that's the message that gets out there. So if you show the inventors, if you show the inventions, you show what they're doing, then you change the psyche. It's mental. It gets in there. All the advertising that we see every day, it gets into the brain. That's how it works. So we can show these people in the public space and all these inventions that they're being done. So when we look at Black inventors on Google, we see Garrett Morgan, 1924, the traffic light. We see Lewis Latimer, 1898. That's not inspiring anybody to want to be an inventor, but we see Nick Fuller from IBM, cloud technology, Kimberly Starks, IBM, doing all kind of fantastic things. People at Lenovo doing microprocessor design who are Black and Asian and women. If you see that, then that changes your mind, and that's largely what a lot of this is about.
Great, thank you. I had a question for Bob really quickly. You mentioned sort of the frequent flyer sort of game that those top inventors or people that contribute IP. I'm wondering, you mentioned trade secrets. Is there any thought about like open source contributions and any underrepresented groups that contribute to the public domain?
Yeah, for sure. Although until very recently, Seagate wasn't really keen on open source contributions. Things have changed quite a bit in the past year for us. But yeah, it's a great comment.
Yeah, that's something Nielsen is evolving in right now as well. It's a weird thing to take patent professionals who are used to leveraging proprietary technology and getting some return on that, and then flip the whole thing on its head. But it's sort of we're trying to figure out how to get the messaging right, and it's something where there's a lot of interest. So you can't get away from it for sure.
Hey, Jason, could you talk a little bit about trying to do this globally? I mean, Lenovo is a Chinese company, and what's diversity in China is different than what is diversity in the US, and just what some of those challenges are?
Yes, short answer, it's hard. But I know for us, we've been really working with our HR and trying to understand exactly how they make those distinctions. We have a pretty robust diversity office that has tackled some of these issues around, how diversity is defined. And so working with them to understand, and learn from them how they define diversity in China. And so one thing that we are seeing, at least in the data, is that under race and ethnicity, it is very geography based. So we have, black, white distinctions here. I think even in Canada, there was some interesting distinctions about how they define mixed gendered or mixed race people that was different from how we would define it here. But in China, a lot of it was more ethnic centric and different groups of people in China. And so while we do have kind of an Asian category of Asian descent in the US for our US listeners, in China, they have 7 distinctions. And then just understanding, what that means. Is that an actual distinction in practice where we need more representation from each of these groups, or just, doesn't matter. Basically working with our HR to try and understand, what these distinctions mean and what is relevant to what we're trying to do as far as diversity will vary by geo.
Got a couple rapid fire questions from the audience. Does anyone know if the USPTO will be releasing another progress report?
I know they did an update. I don't know what year that was. Look at last.
It was 2020.
Okay. I don't know what will come next though.
Another question is, does anyone use innovation profiling services like Swarm Vision? Or any other innovation profiling services? Nope. No takers. Okay. I think that's all the questions that we have.
Well, I had another comment. Can I make another comment?
Sure. Go ahead.
So in terms of everybody's looking for data. So USPTO doesn't track certain things, but you can look in the USPTO database and you can search for companies by country. You can see which countries are filing patents in the US. It's not, so the US is, not that everybody files in the US, but most countries do. And then you can also search by inventor. So inventors have to disclose in the declaration, in the patent declaration, which country that they're from. So you can look at countries for inventors. So if they're from America, right, you can't tell. But you can look at like Jamaica, for example. Jamaica this year, there's four patents that have been filed by Jamaican companies this year in the US, like 4. There's, I think, 11 from, I was looking at Panama. There's like 12,000 from Korea. So, you can kind of figure out the patent data in different ways. There's actually 1 from Nigeria and 1 from Ghana. And the 1 from Nigeria is a design patent. So, so that's kind of reflective in a way also. That's important as well, is the international aspect of it. America is, do we have a responsibility for Central America and South America? Is that, is it like a reverse Monroe Doctrine? Do we care about what's going on in the Caribbean? And, I think we do in a sense. And then a lot of inventors will come from there. So like people who know like Black engineering schools, like I went to Howard University, there's a lot of Jamaicans there. There's a big international contingent that work at these companies. But, are they empowering, that's kind of a larger discussion about which companies are filing for patents and which countries are filing for patents, but it's important as well. So it's that's part of it. So you can actually look for Jamaican inventors, not that they're all going to be Black or people from Trinidad, but more than likely they will be. So that's another way to track the data as well. Just something to add to it.
So Jesse, if I were to maybe boil that down a little bit, do you think that companies who have offices or R&D groups in those locations should be looking at that data to see how their innovation is spread across countries? Again, I'm trying to tie it back to what companies are doing. Is that kind of, what is that responsibility?
Well, I was more thinking about where the companies are operating, you know, and almost like manufacturing in a way. I mean, a lot of these companies, like even here today, who are talking, have offices in different places, have inventors from different places. So I was more kind of focusing on, I guess, where the inventors are from and what countries are filing for patents. That's kind of what I was kind of getting at. Which countries are filing for patents as a way of tracking diversity. Another way of tracking diversity.
I think another way of looking at it is what your invention disclosure process is. So for example, if you have operations outside the US, who is the one deciding whether or not to go forward with that disclosure if it's non-US? Is it someone in the US? Is it someone outside the US? It introduces a huge, another layer of complexity for sure. And figure out, because for example, you know, large companies have operations in other countries, but if the invention disclosure team, the leads are in the US, they might have a bias towards a certain country, saying that this country doesn't produce a sufficient of quality for us to file in the US. And they just might have that subconscious bias. And I think it's hard to kind of tackle that. But I think like Jesse mentioned, I think if you look at the data, I think that would sort of help try to uncover that a little bit.
Other questions? Joy, you want to elaborate on your post?
Yeah, I was just going to say that sometimes with the incentive programs, if you're giving monetary incentives, I think there's a bias because there's a perception that other countries are submitting disclosures just to get the incentive if they're from, you know, poorer countries. I've definitely encountered that in the industry.
I think we've seen that at Seagate in the past, where there's been, you know, just some skepticism maybe from disclosures coming from other groups in other countries. We've had the luxury of having an awesome patent attorney out in Singapore, who part of his job is to travel around all our sites in Asia and, you know, engage those sites and the inventors in those sites and making, you know, doing invention workshop training and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, to the point where the quality of disclosures coming out of those sites has greatly improved. So, you know, doing stuff like that can help break down those biases too.
By the way, there's another question I think we may have passed over in the chat was, have you guys looked at inventor retention rates by gender? And did you see any differences there that would be notable?
That's going to be the next thing I look at.
That's right. Next week. All right. Well, go ahead, Jason.
We haven't looked at that, but I think there was a point brought up earlier about, I think, you know, looking farther past the just, you know, like with gender, one thing we're noticing is that our inventors tend to be older inventors. I kind of alluded to kind of the idea that, you know, a lot of these people are at, we acquired some of IBM's portfolio and workforce, and so a lot of them are still kind of the old IBMers, and they've been there a while, and a lot of them tend to be older men, older white men. And so our younger workforce is more diverse, but they're also not participating in the process at the rate that our older ones are too. And so just looking at those ties too of you know, even though you're looking at gender diversity, seeing how, you know, age diversity may play into that, just the interplay of those things has also been helpful in trying to figure out how we create to the problem as well. Now we're working on things that are targeting, you know, the younger inventors, making sure our training is up to date, making sure it's more accessible, making sure it's more geared towards younger inventors rather than 15-year-old training manual that we've been using, making sure that it is a little bit more, you know, up to date, and we have like a, you know, video walkthrough of the disclosure form rather than just kind of boilerplate language that, maybe a younger person might not to read. Figuring out, the ins and outs of their daily job, and so just thinking about all of it rather than kind of focusing on one area,
Our biggest challenge in that area, Suzanne, and I'll just share this for other companies might be like Seagate is. I mean, you think of Seagate, you think of hard drives, one product company, but we're actually hundreds of different technologies. And it's really difficult to pull apart because, the people dealing more in, emerging memories or software, firmware, people in open source or systems, totally different dynamic and kind of behavior, not just in the inventing, but how we're able to retain folks and all that than in the wafer processing stuff or in the mechanical stuff. So it really widely varies based on technology area, which makes it tough.
Yeah, understood. All right, well, come on, we need any more questions, or are we gonna, we have time for one or two and then we'll cut the session. So get it in now. Really? They answered everything? That's amazing. All right. Well, you know where to find them. I encourage you all to reach out to them if you have any more that you want to know about. But you guys are awesome. Really appreciate you sharing your time and your knowledge, and keep it coming. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.